White silk burned against soot-stained walls. The chapel's stained glass windows exploded outward in a shower of colored fragments, and through the smoke, a bride's scream cut through the mountain air like a prayer nobody wanted to hear. Ryan Mitchell didn't think. The wedding driver's uniform he wore meant nothing as he charged through the chapel doors. Flames licked at his sleeves, but all he could see was the figure in white, trapped behind an overturned pew. He'd let fire take someone before. Never again. Victoria Sterling had been 28 years old for exactly 3 months when she realized she'd never made a single choice for herself. Standing in the bridal suite that morning, surrounded by her mother's carefully selected flowers and her father's approved guest list, she'd stared at her reflection and seen a stranger wearing her face. The Sterling family had expectations that stretched back 4 generations of Connecticut old money. Victoria would marry Preston Blackwell, Harvard law graduate and heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, and produce the next generation of perfectly controlled success stories. She'd been groomed for this role since childhood: piano lessons at 4, cotillion at 12, the right boarding school, the right college, the right internship at her father's investment firm. Every birthday party had been a networking opportunity. Every summer vacation had been a chance to meet the right families. Even her college major in art history had been chosen because it was appropriately feminine and unlikely to interfere with her primary purpose as a wife and mother. The wedding dress she wore had belonged to her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and her great-great-grandmother before that. 4 generations of Sterling women had walked down aisles in the same French lace, had promised to love, honor, and obey husbands chosen for their portfolios rather than their hearts. Victoria had tried it on dozens of times during the planning process, and each time she'd felt more like she was being fitted for a beautiful prison. Preston had proposed at the Westchester Country Club during the annual charity gala in front of 300 witnesses, with a 5-carat diamond that felt like a beautiful shackle. She'd said yes because that's what Victoria Sterling was supposed to do. She'd planned the wedding her mother envisioned, in the mountain chapel her great-grandfather had built as a summer retreat, and she'd smiled through every moment of it while feeling like she was watching someone else's life unfold. Her mother had been planning this wedding since Victoria turned 25, the acceptable age for a Sterling daughter to begin seriously considering marriage. The guest list included senators, CEOs, and old money families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. The flowers were imported from 3 different countries. The reception would feature a string quartet that had played for European royalty. Every detail had been orchestrated to reinforce the Sterling family's position in society. But standing there that morning, practicing expressions of joy in the antique mirror that had reflected 4 generations of Sterling brides, Victoria had felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, just crack, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. She'd spent 28 years being the perfect daughter, the perfect fiancée, the perfect everything except herself. When the minister asked if she would love, honor, and obey, she'd hesitated for the first time in her life. That pause had lasted only 3 seconds, but it had been long enough for Preston's mask to slip. She'd seen something cold and calculating flash across his features, the same expression he wore when closing a particularly ruthless business deal. Ryan Mitchell had been delivering flowers to weddings for 3 years, ever since he'd moved to Ridgemont with his daughter Chloe. It was quiet work, invisible work, the kind that let him blend into the background while other people celebrated their beginnings. He drove an old Ford pickup converted into a makeshift delivery truck, painted white with Mitchell's mobile flowers stenciled on the side in letters Chloe had helped him trace with her small, careful hands. The business barely broke even most months, but it paid the bills and kept him home most evenings to help with homework and tuck his 7-year-old daughter into bed. Before Ridgemont, before the quiet mountain town that asked no questions about his past, Ryan had been Fire Captain Mitchell in Denver. He'd met Sarah at a community barbecue, married her 6 months later, and thought he'd figured out how to be happy. They'd bought a little house with a garden Sarah loved, where she grew vegetables they'd eat for dinner and flowers she'd arrange in mason jars throughout the house. When Chloe was born after 2 years of trying, Ryan thought he understood what people meant when they talked about perfect moments that made everything else worthwhile. He'd held his daughter for the first time and felt like his life had finally found its proper shape. The fire that took Sarah had started in their kitchen on a Tuesday morning in October. Ryan had been at the station, running training drills with new recruits, when the call came in over the radio. He'd recognized his own address immediately, had felt his heart stop for a full beat before training kicked in. He'd broken every speed limit getting there, but the house was already gone. The neighbors said Sarah had been trying to save their photo albums from the bedroom closet when a support beam gave way. The coroner said she'd died instantly, a mercy Ryan had never felt merciful about. Chloe had been at daycare when it happened, safe and unaware that her world was changing forever. Ryan had picked her up that afternoon and tried to explain why they couldn't go home, why Mommy wouldn't be coming to get her anymore, why everything they'd built together was gone. She'd been too young to understand the permanence of death, but old enough to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the universe. He'd quit the fire department that day, unable to face the irony of saving other people's families when he'd failed to save his own. They'd sold what remained of their belongings, packed Chloe's toys into boxes, and driven until they found Ridgemont, where nobody knew Fire Captain Ryan Mitchell. Here, he was just Ryan, the flower delivery guy who lived in the cabin at the end of Pine Street with his little girl and her collection of rescued animals. Chloe didn't remember much about her mother, but she had Sarah's laugh and Sarah's way of making friends with broken things. She collected wounded birds, befriended the elderly dogs at the animal shelter, and once spent an entire afternoon teaching the neighbor's autistic son how to braid friendship bracelets. Ryan saw Sarah in every kind gesture Chloe made, every moment of unconscious compassion that reminded him why love was worth the risk of loss. When Ryan saw the smoke rising from St. Mary's Chapel that Saturday afternoon, his hands moved before his mind caught up. He'd parked the truck to deliver forgotten boutonnieres, a detail the wedding planner had called about frantically that morning. But when he heard the screaming, everything else fell away. 3 years of careful distance, of avoiding anything that reminded him of his old life, disappeared in an instant. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. Ryan's hands found Victoria's wrists first, then her waist, pulling her up and over the burning pew that had pinned her dress to the chapel floor. She was lighter than he'd expected, fragile in a way that had nothing to do with her size. Her veil disintegrated as they moved, leaving a trail of burning silk and scattered pearls across the ancient wooden floorboards that had witnessed countless ceremonies over the decades. The heat was overwhelming, the smoke thick enough to taste, but Ryan's training kicked in automatically. He covered her face with his jacket, counted his steps to the door, and carried her into the mountain air that tasted like freedom and smoke. His lungs burned, his eyes streamed, but he didn't stop moving until they were far enough from the building to be safe from falling debris. Outside, he set her down gently on the grass beside his truck, his hands shaking as he checked her for injuries with the systematic thoroughness he'd learned as a first responder. A cut on her forehead where debris had struck her, some burns on her arms where the fabric had caught fire, but she was breathing steadily, her pulse strong, her eyes clear and focused. She was alive, and for the first time in 3 years, Ryan felt like he'd managed to save someone who mattered. But Victoria wasn't looking at him with gratitude or relief. Instead, she was staring at him with the most bewildered expression he'd ever seen, as if his presence made no sense in the carefully ordered world she knew. Her lips moved soundlessly for a moment before she found her voice, and when she finally spoke, her words were barely above a whisper. Before either of them could continue the conversation, they were surrounded by chaos. Photographers who'd been documenting the wedding, family members who'd escaped the fire safely, paramedics responding to emergency calls, police officers trying to establish a perimeter and determine the cause of the blaze. Victoria's mother appeared with a blanket and a stream of concerned chatter about hospitals and insurance claims and what the newspapers would say about this disaster. Her father took charge of the situation with the efficiency of a man accustomed to managing crises and controlling narratives. He spoke in clipped, authoritative tones to the fire chief, the insurance investigator, and the reporters who'd already begun arriving at the scene. Preston stood at a careful distance, his tuxedo still pristine, talking rapidly into his phone about damage control and media statements and liability issues. But Victoria's eyes never left Ryan's face. She seemed to be studying him, searching for something she couldn't name or understand. When the paramedics tried to lead her to the ambulance for a thorough medical evaluation, she shook her head with a quiet determination that surprised everyone, including herself. The request that came out of her mouth next was so unexpected, so completely inappropriate by every social standard she'd been raised to follow, that the entire crowd fell silent. She wanted to go with him, with the flower delivery man in the soot-stained uniform who'd pulled her from the fire. Not to the hospital, not back to her family's estate, not into Preston's carefully controlled damage control strategy. She wanted to go with the stranger who'd risked his life for hers without knowing her name, her worth, or her pedigree. The words felt foreign in her mouth, the first truly independent decision she'd ever made. The reaction was immediate and intense. Her mother's face went white with shock and embarrassment. Her father began speaking in the low, threatening tone he used when business deals weren't going according to plan. Preston ended his phone call abruptly and strode over to take charge of what he clearly saw as a situation spinning out of control. But Ryan found himself nodding before he understood why. There was something in Victoria's expression, desperate but also determined, that reminded him of the way Chloe had looked when he'd first brought her to Ridgemont. Like someone who needed a place to figure out what came next, away from the well-meaning people who thought they knew what was best for her. Victoria's first morning in the Mitchell cabin began with Chloe standing beside the pull-out couch at exactly 6:30, holding a coffee mug decorated with cartoon cats and wearing mismatched pajamas that somehow looked perfectly coordinated on her small frame. The 7-year-old had the serious dignity of someone conducting important diplomatic business as she offered the coffee with both hands. The cabin was small but comfortable, 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, with a kitchen that opened into a living room dominated by Chloe's art projects and Ryan's collection of books about mountain wildflowers and local history. It was the opposite of the Sterling estate where Victoria had grown up, with its 14 rooms and staff quarters and gardens that required a team of professionals to maintain. Here, everything was functional and lived in, and somehow more real than anything Victoria had ever experienced. Chloe had appointed herself Victoria's guide to normal life, a role she took seriously despite her age. She explained the rules of the house, which were simple and made sense in ways that the complex social protocols of Victoria's former life never had. You cleaned up after yourself. You helped with dinner if you were tall enough to reach the stove. You fed the cats before you fed yourself because they depended on you. You said good morning to the flowers in the kitchen window because they were trying their best to grow in difficult conditions. The routine was revolutionary in its simplicity. They ate breakfast together before Ryan left for work, sitting around a table that wobbled slightly but felt more stable than any piece of furniture in the Sterling mansion. Victoria spent her days reading books from Ryan's collection, helping Chloe with school projects, and learning to cook actual meals instead of ordering from restaurants or relying on the family's private chef. Over the next few days, Victoria found herself learning things she'd never needed to know but somehow always wanted to learn. How to make coffee that didn't taste like sugar water. How to fold fitted sheets so they didn't look like angry origami. How to read Chloe's expressions when she was trying not to cry about missing her mother but didn't want to make the adults sad by talking about it. Ryan taught her to identify the wildflowers that grew around the cabin, explaining which ones were native to the mountains and which ones had been brought by settlers decades ago. Chloe taught her to braid friendship bracelets, while they watched old movies on the small television that got exactly 4 channels on good days and none on bad ones. They played board games that actually ended, instead of going on for hours with complicated rules designed to showcase intellectual superiority. Victoria discovered she was good with her hands when she wasn't wearing expensive manicures that prevented her from touching anything substantial. She could fix loose buttons and patch holes in Chloe's jeans, and help Ryan repair the flower truck when it broke down on Tuesday afternoons. She could listen to Chloe's stories about school and offer advice that actually helped instead of just sounding appropriately concerned. Most surprisingly, she could make Ryan laugh with observations about the absurdity of her former life that she'd never been allowed to voice before. Stories about charity galas, where people spent more on a single dinner than most families earned in a month. About the intricate social hierarchies that determined who could speak to whom at what events. About the exhausting performance of being perpetually grateful for a life that felt like an elaborate prison. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic, but it was steady and real. Victoria's hands grew calloused from garden work and cooking. Her skin took on a healthy color from spending time outdoors without constantly reapplying sunscreen. Her laugh became more frequent and less calculated. She began to look like someone who belonged in her own life instead of someone playing a role in someone else's story. 3 weeks into this unexpected existence, Victoria found the tracking device while going through her purse looking for the insurance cards her mother had insisted she carry everywhere. Her fingers closed around a small electronic object she'd never seen before, sophisticated and expensive, the kind of surveillance equipment that required professional installation and constant monitoring. The discovery hit her like cold water, washing away the fragile sense of safety she'd been building. The implications were staggering and terrifying. Preston had been having her followed, probably for months before the wedding. Every coffee shop she'd visited, every friend she'd met for lunch, every moment of privacy she'd thought she had been cataloged and reported back to him. The tracking device meant he knew exactly where she was right now, had probably known since the day she'd left the hospital with Ryan. The insurance investigator called that afternoon with questions about her husband's recent policy changes and some irregularities they'd discovered in the chapel's electrical system. The fire hadn't been entirely accidental. Someone had tampered with the wiring in a way that would have caused an electrical fire during the ceremony, ensuring maximum drama and minimal actual danger to most of the guests. Victoria realized with growing horror that Preston had planned the entire event, possibly as a way to create a crisis that would bind her to him more tightly or eliminate her if she proved too difficult to control. When Ryan came home and found her sitting at the kitchen table with the device in her palm and tears streaming down her face, his reaction was immediate and intense. The quiet, gentle man who brought her wildflowers and taught Chloe to change the oil in the truck disappeared, replaced by someone whose anger was controlled and dangerous. She could see the fire captain he'd once been, the man who'd made split-second decisions in life or death situations. He wanted to drive to Preston's office immediately. He wanted to call the police, hire lawyers, make sure Preston never came near her again. He wanted to protect her from consequences he deemed too difficult for her to handle, to solve her problems with the same decisive action he'd used to pull her from the burning chapel. But Victoria recognized the pattern, and the recognition was devastating because she'd begun to trust Ryan in ways she'd never trusted anyone. Another man making decisions for her, trying to protect her from a world he thought she was too fragile to navigate. Even Ryan, who'd shown her what kindness looked like, was trying to rescue her instead of letting her rescue herself. The argument that followed was quiet but intense, conducted in whispers so Chloe wouldn't hear from her bedroom down the hall. Victoria tried to explain why she needed to handle the situation herself, why being protected felt too much like being controlled. Ryan tried to make her understand that caring about someone meant wanting to keep them safe, that love required action, not just support. They were both right, and they were both wrong, and the gap between their perspectives felt impossible to bridge. Victoria thanked him for caring, packed her few belongings into the small suitcase she'd bought in town, and left while he was at work the next day. Chloe was at school, which made the leaving easier and infinitely harder. She couldn't bear to see the confusion in those bright eyes, couldn't explain why the princess was abandoning the castle where she'd finally learned to be human. Victoria rented a small apartment above the bakery in downtown Ridgemont, close enough to see Ryan's truck when he made deliveries, but far enough away to avoid accidental encounters that would be painful for both of them. She got a job at the local library, shelving books and helping elderly patrons navigate the computer system and teenagers find research materials for school projects. It was quiet work that paid enough to cover her modest expenses and gave her time to think about who she wanted to become when no one else was making suggestions or demands. The library was peaceful in ways she'd never experienced, filled with people pursuing knowledge for its own sake rather than for social advantage. She discovered she enjoyed helping people find exactly the book they needed, matching readers with stories that would change their perspectives or comfort them during difficult times. Ryan didn't come after her, which was somehow worse than if he had. His absence felt like confirmation that she'd been right to leave, that whatever had been growing between them hadn't been strong enough to survive the reality of who she really was. She'd been an interesting project for him, a broken bird that needed temporary shelter, but not someone worth fighting for when fighting became complicated. The apartment was cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Victoria had never lived alone before, had never been responsible for all the small decisions that made up a life. What to eat for dinner when no one else's preferences mattered. Whether to buy the expensive coffee or save the money for something more practical. How to spend Saturday afternoons when there was no one to please and nowhere she was expected to be. She learned to cook simple meals for one person, to do laundry in the building's shared machines, to fall asleep without the sound of other people breathing in nearby rooms. The independence was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. For the first time in her life, she was responsible for her own happiness, her own decisions, her own mistakes. 2 months passed in this careful isolation. Victoria learned to be alone without being lonely, to make decisions based on what she wanted instead of what was expected or what would please other people. She discovered she liked mystery novels and documentary films and the way the mountains looked different every morning depending on the weather and the season. She made tentative friendships with her coworkers and regular library patrons who didn't know anything about her past or her family's expectations. Mrs. Henderson, who came in every Tuesday to check out romance novels, taught her to knit. David, the teenager who was researching colleges his parents couldn't afford, helped her understand financial aid forms. These relationships were simple and honest, based on mutual respect rather than social obligation. Then Chloe appeared at the library one afternoon after school, clutching a drawing she'd made and wearing the determined expression she got when she'd decided to fix something broken. The picture showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a small house, labeled Daddy, Chloe, and Princess Victoria in purple crayon, that had been applied with extra pressure to make the letters darker. At the bottom, in Chloe's careful printing, were the words, "Come home, please." The conversation that followed was brief and devastating in its honesty. Chloe missed their morning coffee ritual and the way Victoria helped her with math homework by making word problems about cats instead of abstract numbers. Ryan hadn't smiled since Victoria left, hadn't brought home any new wildflowers for the kitchen window, hadn't played guitar in the evenings like he used to before his wife died, and started again after Victoria moved in. The cats were sad because they could sense the sadness in the house, Chloe explained with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who'd learned to read emotional atmospheres for her own survival. Most importantly, Chloe had figured out that grown-ups sometimes made mistakes when they were scared, and maybe Victoria was scared of being happy because she wasn't used to it, and maybe Ryan was scared of losing someone again, so he tried too hard to keep people safe. That evening, Victoria walked past Ryan's cabin on her way home from work, a route that was longer than necessary but had become a habit she couldn't break. Through the kitchen window, she could see him helping Chloe with homework at the small table where they'd shared so many meals. His movements were careful and patient, but there was something defeated in the set of his shoulders that made her chest ache. He looked like a man going through the motions of living without remembering why life mattered. The next morning, Victoria called in sick to work and drove to the overlook where Ryan had first shown her the wildflower meadows that bloomed in different colors throughout the summer. She needed space to think, to understand what she was feeling and what she was afraid of and what she was willing to risk for the possibility of happiness. The view from up there made everything look manageable. The town spread out below like a miniature version of itself, where problems had solutions and broken things could be fixed with patience and the right tools. She could see the library where she worked, the bakery where she lived, the elementary school where Chloe spent her days, the cabin at the end of Pine Street where she'd learned what home could feel like. She was still sitting there when Ryan's truck pulled up beside her car 2 hours later. He didn't say anything at first, just sat on the tailgate and looked out at the mountains like he was trying to memorize them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and careful, as if he was afraid the wrong words might send her running again, might break something that was already barely holding together. He told her about the call he'd received that morning from a family whose house had caught fire during the night. He'd been the first person they'd called, not the fire department, because word had gotten around that Ryan Mitchell knew about fires and could be trusted in emergencies. He'd helped them get organized, had known which documents to save and which belongings could be replaced, had stayed with them until the official responders arrived. For the first time since Sarah's death, he'd felt like himself again. Not the man who'd failed to save his wife, but the man who could make a difference when it mattered. He'd realized that protecting people wasn't about making their choices for them or solving their problems without consulting them. It was about making sure they had the information and support they needed to solve their own problems, about standing beside them while they fought their own battles instead of fighting those battles for them. Victoria understood what he wasn't saying directly, that he'd learned the difference between controlling someone and caring about them, that he'd rather lose her by respecting her autonomy than keep her by taking it away, that he was sorry for trying to fight her battles instead of asking how he could support her while she fought them herself. The conversation that followed was the most honest either of them had ever had. Victoria explained why she'd left, why trust was so difficult for someone who'd never been allowed to trust her own judgment or make her own mistakes. Ryan talked about Sarah, about the guilt that had shaped every decision he'd made since her death, about the fear that caring about someone meant failing to protect them. They spoke about Chloe, about the responsibility of showing a child what healthy love looked like versus what controlling love looked like, about the difference between partnership and protection, between supporting someone and rescuing them, about the courage it took to love someone without trying to change them or save them from themselves. By the time the sun set, They'd reached an understanding that felt more solid than any promise Victoria had ever made or received. They would try again, but differently this time. As equals who chose each other, instead of people who needed each other to fill empty spaces in their lives. As partners who supported each other's growth instead of people who tried to keep each other safe from all possible harm. Victoria moved back into the cabin gradually, bringing one box at a time until the space felt like home again instead of temporary shelter. She kept her job at the library because she'd discovered she was good at it, and because having her own work mattered to her sense of independence and self-worth. Ryan expanded his flower delivery service to include event planning, and Victoria found she had a talent for organizing celebrations that felt personal rather than performative. The business grew slowly but steadily, built on word-of-mouth recommendations from couples who appreciated their approach to weddings and other celebrations. Victoria discovered she was gifted at helping people articulate what they really wanted their special day to look like, as opposed to what tradition or family expectations dictated. Ryan's steady presence and practical skills made even the most unconventional events run smoothly. Chloe appointed herself the official photographer for their new family business, taking pictures with an old camera Ryan had found at a garage sale and taught her to use. Her shots were sometimes crooked and occasionally blurry, but they captured something professional photographers often missed: the moment when a couple forgot about the cameras and just looked at each other. The expression on a grandmother's face when she saw her granddaughter in a wedding dress. The quiet satisfaction of a job well done. 1 year after the fire, they'd built something none of them had expected. Mitchell Family Celebrations specialized in helping people who wanted to start over, to celebrate new beginnings without the weight of family expectations or social obligations. They worked with couples who'd been married before, with people whose families didn't approve of their choices, with anyone who wanted their special day to reflect who they really were instead of who they were supposed to be. Their reputation spread through word of mouth rather than expensive advertising campaigns. People called them when they wanted a wedding in a national park instead of a country club, when they wanted to exchange vows in their grandmother's backyard rather than a formal chapel, when they wanted to promise forever to someone their parents would never understand but who made them feel like the best version of themselves. The work was satisfying in ways Victoria had never experienced in her previous life of charity committees and social obligations. Every event they planned mattered to the people involved. Every celebration they created helped someone mark an important transition in their life in a way that felt authentic and meaningful. They weren't just planning parties, they were helping people claim their own stories. Victoria discovered she was gifted at helping couples navigate the gap between what their families expected and what their hearts required. She could mediate between traditional parents and unconventional children, could find compromises that honored family relationships without sacrificing personal authenticity. Her own experience of breaking free from family expectations gave her credibility with clients who were struggling with similar challenges. Ryan's background as a first responder served him well in event planning. He could anticipate problems before they occurred, could handle emergencies with calm efficiency, could make any venue feel safe and welcoming. His gentle manner and practical approach helped nervous couples relax and enjoy their celebrations instead of worrying about everything that could go wrong. The business gave them a way to be together without defining their relationship in traditional terms that neither of them felt comfortable with. They were partners in work and life, committed to each other and to Chloe without needing a certificate to prove it or a ceremony to validate what they'd built together. Victoria had legally changed her name to Victoria Mitchell, not because she'd married Ryan, but because she'd chosen to be part of the family they'd created together. On a crisp October morning, exactly 2 years after the fire that had changed everything, they were setting up for a wedding in the national forest when the bride, a young woman named Sarah, asked Victoria if she'd ever been afraid of starting over. The question came while they were arranging wildflowers that Ryan had gathered from the same meadow where he'd first shown Victoria how to identify different species and understand their growing patterns. Victoria considered the question seriously, as she always did when brides asked her for advice. Fear had been her constant companion for so long that learning to live without it had been like learning to walk without crutches. Starting over meant admitting that everything she'd been taught about what life should look like had been wrong. It meant trusting her own judgment after 28 years of being told she didn't have good judgment. It meant believing she deserved happiness even when she couldn't prove she'd earned it. But it also meant discovering who she really was when no one was watching or judging or trying to shape her into someone else's vision of perfection. It meant finding work that fulfilled her instead of just looking good on a resume. It meant loving someone who saw her clearly and chose her anyway, and being loved by a child who expected nothing from her except presence and authenticity. It meant building something that mattered with people who mattered to her. Looking across the clearing where Ryan was teaching the groom how to tie proper knots for the rustic archway they'd built together, where Chloe was adjusting her camera settings to capture the perfect light filtering through the pine trees, Victoria felt the deep satisfaction of a life chosen rather than assigned. The fire had destroyed the person she'd been expected to be, but it had also cleared the ground for the person she'd decided to become. The wedding that afternoon was simple and perfect, the kind of celebration that felt like a beginning rather than a performance. The bride and groom had written their own vows, promising to support each other's dreams and face their fears together. The guest list was small, made up of people who genuinely cared about the couple's happiness, rather than people who needed to be impressed or appeased. The decorations were wildflowers and handmade details that reflected the couple's personalities rather than current trends. As the sun set behind the mountains and the last of the guests headed home with leftover cake and flowers to press in books, Victoria found herself thinking about cycles and seasons, about how some things needed to burn down completely before new growth could begin. The chapel where her old life had ended was being rebuilt, but she had no desire to see it. She'd found her church in wildflower meadows and kitchen tables, in quiet conversations and shared responsibilities, in the daily choice to show up for the people who mattered most. Chloe fell asleep in the truck on the way home, her camera clutched against her chest and her small face peaceful in the dashboard light. Ryan carried her inside while Victoria unloaded the leftover flowers, already thinking about which ones could be dried and preserved and which ones should be composted to feed next spring's garden. The routine was familiar now, comfortable in the way that home should be comfortable. Later, sitting on the porch with cups of coffee that had become their evening ritual, Victoria and Ryan watched the stars appear one by one over the mountains they'd learned to call home. They didn't need to talk about the day or plan for tomorrow, or analyze what they'd built together. It was enough to sit quietly and know that they'd chosen well, that they'd created. In a small wooden cabin by Lake Champlain, Vermont, William Sterling, one of New York's most powerful real estate moguls, found himself on his knees before a man in a simple flannel shirt. "Please," William whispered, his voice breaking with desperation, "help my daughter. I've tried everything." The man studied the 25-year-old woman sitting silently nearby, her sightless eyes staring into nothingness. He leaned down and whispered something into her ear, words no one else could hear. For the first time in 3 years, Sophia nodded. William Sterling had built an empire that touched the Manhattan skyline with gleaming towers bearing his name. At 60, he commanded boardrooms where billion-dollar deals were sealed with handshakes, where his word could reshape entire neighborhoods. The Sterling Group had risen from his father's modest construction company into a real estate dynasty that controlled some of the most valuable properties in America. Yet for all his power, for all the influence that made politicians return his calls and celebrities seek his favor, William Sterling felt utterly powerless. His corner office on the 50th floor of Sterling Tower offered a commanding view of Central Park, where autumn leaves painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The mahogany desk that had once belonged to his father held photographs of better times. William with his late wife Margaret at charity galas, family vacations in the Hamptons, Sophia's Harvard graduation where she had delivered the valedictorian speech with such brilliance that even the hardened business leaders in attendance had wept. Margaret had died 5 years ago, her battle with cancer fought with the same grace she had brought to everything else in her life. She had made William promise to take care of their daughter, to ensure Sophia found her own path to happiness. It was a promise he was failing to keep. Sophia had been everything a father could hope for, brilliant, compassionate, driven. She had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School, speaking fluent French and Mandarin, with plans to expand Sterling Group's international holdings. She had been dating a promising young lawyer, had friends who adored her, had the world at her fingertips. Then came that terrible night 3 years ago, when Sophia had been driving to Mount Sinai Hospital to visit a friend who had been in an accident. The collision happened on the FDR Drive during a sudden rainstorm, a drunk driver running a red light, a moment that changed everything. The surgeries had failed. The specialists had done their best, but the damage to Sophia's optic nerves was irreversible. She would never see again. But the blindness was only the beginning. In the months that followed, Sophia retreated into herself, refusing to leave her room, barely eating, speaking only when absolutely necessary. The confident young woman who had once commanded respect in corporate negotiations became a shadow, afraid of the world she could no longer see. William had hired the best therapists money could buy, taken her to clinics in Switzerland and Japan, consulted with experts from Johns Hopkins and the Mayo Clinic. Nothing helped. Sophia remained trapped in her own darkness, and William watched helplessly as his daughter slowly disappeared. Now, 3 years later, William spent his nights staring out at the city lights, wondering where he had gone wrong. He had given Sophia everything: the best education, opportunities most people could only dream of, the security of unlimited wealth. But none of it mattered now. His daughter was slipping away, and all his power, all his money, all his connections couldn't bring her back. That was when he heard about Dr. Nathan Hayes. 300 miles north, in a cabin that seemed worlds away from Sterling Tower's gleaming heights, Dr. Nathan Hayes was teaching his 8-year-old son Jake how to properly sand a piece of oak. The wood would become a new bookshelf for Jake's growing collection of nature guides and adventure stories. Nathan's hands, once steady enough to perform the most delicate eye surgeries, now found peace in simple carpentry. There was something honest about working with wood. If you made a mistake, you could sand it down and start over. If only life were so forgiving. Nathan had once been the most sought-after ophthalmologist in New York City. At 35, he was still young, but his reputation was that of a master surgeon. He had graduated from Harvard Medical School at 24, completed his residency at Johns Hopkins, and quickly established himself as someone who could save vision when others had given up hope. His Manhattan practice had a waiting list months long, and his research on retinal regeneration had been published in the world's most prestigious medical journals. He had been married to Dr. Rebecca Hayes, a brilliant pediatrician who shared his passion for healing. Together, they had been medicine's golden couple, saving lives and building a beautiful life together. Jake had been the center of their world, a bright, curious boy who asked endless questions about everything from why leaves changed color to how birds knew where to fly in winter. Nathan would spend hours with him, explaining the mysteries of the natural world, teaching him to observe and think and wonder. Rebecca would join them for their weekend hikes in the Adirondacks, where Jake would collect interesting rocks and Rebecca would identify wildflowers. They had been planning to have another child, had already picked out names, and started converting Nathan's home office into a nursery. Then came the night that shattered everything. Nathan had been in the middle of a complex surgery to save the sight of a construction worker who had been injured in an accident. It was delicate work, requiring absolute concentration and steady hands. That was when the call came. Rebecca had been in a car accident while rushing to the hospital to treat a child who had been severely injured in a house fire. She had been hit by a drunk driver just blocks from their apartment. Nathan faced an impossible choice: leave his patient on the operating table to rush to Rebecca's side, or finish the surgery and pray that other doctors could save his wife. He chose to complete the surgery. When he finally reached Rebecca's bedside 20 minutes later, she had been gone for 15 minutes. The construction worker would keep his sight, but Nathan had lost the love of his life. The guilt consumed him like a cancer, eating away at his confidence, his purpose, his ability to hold a scalpel without his hands shaking. He had saved a stranger's vision while failing to save the woman he loved most. How could he trust himself with another patient's sight when he couldn't protect what mattered most? The medical board had been understanding when Nathan requested a leave of absence. His colleagues assured him it was temporary, that grief was a process, that he would heal and return stronger than before. But Nathan knew better. He had broken something inside himself that night, something that couldn't be repaired with time or therapy or good intentions. He had failed the most important test of his life, and he couldn't risk failing again. So he took Jake and left the city behind, trading his Manhattan practice for a simple life in Vermont, where the only lives he was responsible for were his own and his son's. The autumn afternoon was crisp and clear when William Sterling's black BMW wound its way up the mountain road toward Nathan's cabin. Nathan heard the expensive engine long before he saw the car. It was a sound that didn't belong in their quiet world of birdsong and rustling leaves. He was teaching Jake how to measure twice and cut once, an old carpenter's wisdom that had served them well in their new life. When the sleek sedan pulled into their gravel driveway, Nathan felt his stomach tighten. Cars like that meant only one thing: someone wanted the doctor he used to be. William Sterling emerged from the driver's seat wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. He moved with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, but Nathan could see something desperate in his eyes. Behind him, moving slowly with a white cane, came a young woman whose beauty couldn't be dimmed by the lost expression in her sightless eyes. Nathan's medical training kicked in automatically, noting the way she held herself, the careful precision of her movements, the invisible weight she seemed to carry. "Dr. Hayes," William said, his voice carrying the authority of boardrooms and power lunches. "I know you're not practicing anymore, but I need your help. This is my daughter, Sophia. She's been blind for 3 years, and I'm running out of options." Nathan wanted to close the door, to retreat to the safety of his simple life. He had stopped being Dr. Hayes the day Rebecca died. But something about the young woman's stillness, the way she stood so carefully apart from the world, reminded him of patients he had once helped. Jake peered curiously from behind the half-built bookshelf, his eyes wide with interest at these unexpected visitors. "I don't practice medicine anymore," Nathan said quietly. "I'm sorry, but you've made the trip for nothing." That was when Jake's natural curiosity got the better of him. The 8-year-old approached Sophia with the fearless interest of childhood. "Why can't you see me?" he asked with innocent directness. Sophia startled at the sound of his voice, instinctively taking a step backward. Nathan saw her hands tremble slightly, recognized the signs of someone who had learned to fear the unexpected. But instead of the panic he expected, something else flickered across her face, a moment of recognition, as if Jake's voice had stirred some buried memory. Nathan found himself moving closer, his medical instincts overriding his determination to stay uninvolved. He knelt down so he was at Sophia's eye level, studying her face with the careful attention he had once reserved for his most challenging cases. There was intelligence there, strength, but also a deep exhaustion that spoke of battles fought and lost. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered, the words coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. For the first time in 3 years, Sophia turned her head toward the sound of a stranger's voice. For the first time since the accident, she nodded. The days that followed established a rhythm unlike anything Nathan had experienced since Rebecca's death. William had returned to New York reluctantly, trusting his most precious possession to a man he barely knew. Sophia moved through the cabin like a ghost at first, accepting the small room Nathan had prepared for her but remaining carefully distant from the life humming around her. She ate little, spoke less, and spent most of her time sitting by the window listening to sounds from the lake. Nathan didn't push. His years of medical practice had taught him that healing couldn't be rushed, that sometimes the most powerful medicine was simply being present. Instead, he continued his daily routines with Jake, describing their activities in gentle detail, not for Sophia's benefit specifically, but because it felt natural to fill the silence with words. When he made breakfast, he talked about the way the bacon sizzled in the pan and how the morning light filtered through the kitchen windows. When he and Jake worked on their carpentry projects, he explained the grain of the wood and the purpose of each tool. Jake, with the adaptability of childhood, simply accepted Sophia as part of their household. He shared his nature collection with her, pressing smooth stones and interesting leaves into her hands so she could experience their textures. He read his adventure books aloud in the evenings, his young voice bringing pirates and explorers to life in their cozy living room. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Sophia began to respond. She started eating more of Nathan's simple meals. She asked Jake to repeat a particularly exciting passage from his book. She even smiled when Jake described the antics of the squirrels who raided their bird feeder each morning. The breakthrough came on a quiet afternoon when Nathan was teaching Jake about the different types of clouds visible through their bedroom window. Sophia had been sitting nearby, ostensibly just enjoying the warmth of the autumn sun, but Nathan noticed how still she became when he spoke about the way cumulus clouds looked like cotton balls stretched across the blue sky. "I used to paint clouds," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time she had volunteered information about her life before the accident. "What did they look like in your paintings?" Nathan asked gently. "Different every time," Sophia replied, and for a moment, her voice carried an echo of the passion she had once felt. Sometimes they were fierce and dramatic, all dark grays and purples. Sometimes they were soft and peaceful, like the thoughts you have just before falling asleep. That evening, Sophia asked if she could sit with them while Nathan read Jake his bedtime story. The next morning, she helped prepare breakfast, using her hands to carefully slice fruit while Nathan guided her movements with quiet instructions. When Jake scraped his knee during an enthusiastic game of hide and seek, Sophia was the one who cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, her movements confident and sure in a way that surprised them all. "Where did you learn to do that?" Nathan asked, watching her apply the bandage with professional skill. "I spent a lot of time in hospitals after my accident," Sophia said simply. "You pick things up." It was then that Nathan began to understand that Sophia's retreat from the world wasn't just about her blindness. It was about feeling useless, powerless, unable to contribute. In his cabin, away from the well-meaning helpers and expensive specialists, she was discovering that she still had value, that her hands and heart and mind could still make a difference. 3 weeks into Sophia's stay, the tranquil rhythm of their days was shattered by an accident that would change everything. Jake had been playing with a piece of scrap wood from their latest project, pretending it was a sword in an elaborate pirate adventure. The wood splintered unexpectedly, sending a sharp fragment directly into his left eye. His screams of pain and terror filled the cabin as blood began to flow down his cheek. Nathan's reaction was immediate and devastating. The sight of his son's injury, the blood, the desperate need for surgical intervention, it all crashed over him like a tidal wave of memory. He saw Rebecca lying broken in the hospital bed, saw the construction worker's damaged retina under his surgical microscope, felt the weight of every life he had held in his trembling hands. His medical training screamed at him to act, to examine the wound, to assess the damage, but his body betrayed him. His hands shook uncontrollably, his vision blurred with panic, and his legs nearly gave out beneath him. "I can't," he whispered, backing away from his injured son. "I can't do this anymore." It was Sophia who stepped forward. Moving with surprising confidence, she knelt beside the sobbing Jake and gently took his face in her hands. Her fingers, trained by months of navigating the world without sight, carefully explored the area around his eye while her voice remained calm and reassuring. "Jake, honey, I need you to hold very still for me," she said, her tone carrying an authority that cut through his panic. "Can you open your eye? Just a little bit?" With steady hands that seemed to know exactly what they were doing, Sophia guided Nathan through each step of the examination. She had Nathan bring her clean water and soft cloths, had him shine a flashlight while she carefully cleaned away the blood. Her questions were precise and medical. Could Jake see light and shadow? Could he track her fingers' movement? Was there any pain when she gently pressed around the orbital bone? "The splinter missed his eye completely," she announced with obvious relief. "It's just a superficial cut on his eyelid. It looks worse than it is, because head wounds bleed so much." Nathan stared at this woman who had spent 3 years hiding from the world, who had convinced herself she was broken and useless, as she calmly bandaged his son's wound with expert care. Her movements were confident, her medical knowledge obvious, her bedside manner gentle but professional. "How do you know all this?" he asked when Jake had been settled with a story and an ice pack. "I was pre-med before I switched to business," Sophia replied quietly. "I always wondered what would have happened if I had stayed with medicine instead of following my father into real estate." That night, as Jake slept peacefully with nothing more serious than a bandaged eyelid and a story to tell his friends, Nathan found himself really seeing Sophia for the first time. She wasn't the broken victim he had assumed her to be. She was a woman who had lost her way, yes, but who still carried within her the strength and knowledge and compassion that had once driven her toward healing. She had saved his son when Nathan's own hands had failed him, had stepped into the crisis with exactly the skills that were needed. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything he couldn't express. Sophia smiled, and for the first time since the accident, it reached her eyes. "Thank you for letting me help." The transformation in Sophia over the following days was remarkable. She moved through the cabin with new purpose, helping with meals, reading to Jake, even assisting Nathan with his carpentry projects by holding pieces steady while he worked. She began asking questions about Nathan's medical background, sharing stories about her own abandoned dreams of becoming a doctor. They discovered a shared passion for the science of healing, for the delicate artistry required to repair what had been broken. Most importantly, Sophia began to talk about the future instead of dwelling in the past. She spoke about adaptive technologies that could help the visually impaired, about medical school programs that accommodated students with disabilities, about the possibility of using her experience to help other people navigate their own losses. Nathan watched this renaissance with growing amazement, realizing that in helping Sophia find her strength, he was beginning to rediscover his own. Jake, oblivious to the deeper currents of healing flowing around him, simply enjoyed having what felt like a complete family for the first time since his mother's death. He had never known Rebecca, but Sophia filled a space in their lives that Nathan hadn't even realized was empty. She listened to his stories with genuine interest, helped him with his reading, and brought a gentleness to their daily routines that had been missing since they had fled to Vermont. But as Sophia bloomed back to life, Nathan found himself struggling with a growing weight of guilt and fear. He had recognized something familiar about her from their first meeting, something that nagged at the edges of his memory like a half-remembered dream. When William called to check on his daughter's progress and mentioned that her accident had occurred at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, Nathan's blood ran cold. Mount Sinai, the same hospital where Rebecca had died, the same hospital where Nathan had made the choice that had haunted him ever since. When William Sterling returned to the cabin 6 weeks later, expecting to collect his daughter and return to their old life, he found a young woman transformed. Sophia greeted him with confidence, moving through the cabin's spaces with easy familiarity, laughing at Jake's jokes, discussing meal plans with Nathan as if she belonged there. The broken shell of a person he had brought to Vermont had been replaced by someone who seemed to glow with renewed purpose and joy. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," William said, embracing his daughter with tears in his eyes. "You look like yourself again." "I feel like myself," Sophia replied. "For the first time in 3 years, I feel like I have something to offer the world." But William's joy was tempered by a growing unease as he watched the easy intimacy between Sophia and Nathan, the way they moved around each other with practiced coordination, the obvious affection in their voices when they spoke. This wasn't just successful therapy, this was love, deep and real, and complicated by factors William was only beginning to understand. That evening, after Sophia and Jake had gone to bed, William confronted Nathan about his growing suspicions. "I've been doing some research, Dr. Hayes, about your background, your reasons for leaving medicine. I know about your wife's death, and I know it happened at Mount Sinai Hospital on the same night my daughter had her accident." Nathan's face went white, but he didn't deny the connection. "I was wondering when you would figure it out. Were you involved in Sophia's treatment?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Nathan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of guilt and deception pressing down on him like a physical force. "I was the surgeon who operated on her eyes," he said quietly. "I was the one who failed to save her sight." The confession hit William like a physical blow. All this time, the man who had brought his daughter back to life was the same man who had destroyed her vision in the first place. The irony was cruel beyond measure, the betrayal devastating in its complexity. "You knew," William said, his voice barely controlled. "You knew who she was when I brought her here." "No," Nathan said urgently. "I swear to you, I didn't recognize her until you mentioned Mount Sinai tonight. By then, I was already in love with her, and she was already healing. How could I tell her the truth and destroy everything she had gained?" "She has a right to know," William said, but his voice lacked conviction. He had seen his daughter's transformation, had witnessed the joy returning to her life. How could he be the one to take that away from her again? "The night of her surgery," Nathan continued, his voice breaking with remembered pain, "I had just lost Rebecca. I couldn't focus, couldn't think clearly. My hands were shaking, my judgment was compromised. I should have handed the case to someone else, but I was too proud, too stubborn, too broken to admit I wasn't capable. Sophia lost her sight because I was selfish enough to operate when I had no business holding a scalpel." The two men sat in the darkness by the lake, both wrestling with impossible choices. William felt torn between his rage at the man who had destroyed his daughter's life and his gratitude to the man who had restored her spirit. Nathan struggled with the knowledge that his greatest failure had somehow led to his greatest chance at redemption. The next morning brought an uncomfortable tension to the cabin as both men tried to act normally while carrying the weight of their shared secret. Sophia, with the heightened perceptions that came with her blindness, immediately sensed that something had changed. "What's wrong?" she asked Nathan directly. "You're different today. Distant." Nathan couldn't meet her eyes, couldn't find words that wouldn't be lies. William watched his daughter's growing confusion and anxiety, saw the way she reached for Nathan's hand and felt him pull away slightly. The easy intimacy that had characterized their relationship was suddenly strained, and Sophia could feel it even if she couldn't understand it. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain in a way it hadn't been for weeks. "No," Nathan said quickly. "You've done nothing wrong. You're perfect." But the reassurance rang hollow, and Sophia retreated into herself with the practiced skill of someone who had learned to protect against rejection and disappointment. She stopped participating in their conversations, stopped helping with meals, stopped reading to Jake. The progress of weeks began to unravel in a matter of hours. Jake, sensitive to the emotional currents around him, became clingy and worried. "Why is everyone sad?" he asked Nathan privately. "Did I do something bad when I got hurt?" "No, buddy," Nathan assured him. "The grown-ups are just having some complicated feelings. It's not your fault." But Jake's innocent questions only made Nathan's guilt worse. His son had found happiness in their makeshift family, had bloomed under Sophia's attention and care. How could Nathan explain that the woman Jake was beginning to see as a mother figure was someone Nathan had irreparably harmed? How could he reconcile his love for Sophia with the knowledge that he was the architect of her greatest loss? By the third day of this painful dance around the truth, William could bear it no longer. Watching his daughter sink back into isolation while Nathan tortured himself with guilt was destroying any chance for healing on any side. The secret was poisoning everything it touched, turning love into betrayal and hope into despair. "Sophia," he said, finding her sitting alone by the lake where she had taken to spending her days. "We need to talk. There's something you need to know about Nathan, about your accident, about why you're really here." "I know," she said quietly, her voice carrying a resignation that broke his heart. "I've known for days that you're both hiding something from me. I can hear it in your voices, feel it in the way Nathan won't touch me anymore. Just tell me what it is." William sat beside his daughter on the wooden bench Nathan had built beside the water, struggling to find words for an impossible truth. "Nathan was your surgeon at Mount Sinai. He's the doctor who operated on your eyes the night of your accident." Sophia sat in absolute stillness for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what her father had just revealed. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the lapping of the lake against the shore. "He's the one who made me blind." "Yes. And he knew? When you brought me here, he knew who I was? He says he didn't recognize you until I mentioned Mount Sinai. By then, you were already getting better, and he was already falling in love with you." Sophia stood up abruptly, her movements sharp with anger and betrayal. 3 years, she said, her voice rising. 3 years I've lived in darkness, and the man responsible has been pretending to care about me, pretending to love me, letting me fall in love with him." "Sophia, wait," William said. But she was already walking back toward the cabin with the determined stride of someone who had made a decision. Nathan was splitting wood behind the cabin when Sophia found him, his axe falling in steady rhythm as he worked out his own internal turmoil through physical labor. He heard her approach and stopped, leaning on the axe handle as he waited for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. "Is it true?" she asked without preamble. "Are you the surgeon who operated on my eyes?" Nathan set down the axe and faced her fully, his hands steady for the first time in days. "Yes." "And you've known this whole time?" "Not the whole time. I didn't recognize you when your father first brought you here. It wasn't until he mentioned Mount Sinai that I realized who you were." Sophia laughed bitterly. "So for weeks, you've been playing house with the woman whose life you destroyed. How does that feel?" "Like the worst kind of torture," Nathan replied honestly. "Every day I watched you get stronger, watched you smile, watched you find joy again, knowing that I was the reason you needed to heal in the first place. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were getting better," Nathan said simply. "Because you were happy. Because I was selfish enough to want to keep loving you, even though I had no right to." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, her hands clenched at her sides as she struggled with emotions too complex to untangle. "The night of my surgery," she said finally, "what happened? I've never gotten a straight answer from any of the doctors who treated me afterward." Nathan took a deep breath, knowing that this confession might destroy any chance they had at a future together. "My wife had just died in a car accident. I was in the middle of your surgery when I got the call. I had to choose between finishing your operation and going to her bedside. I chose to finish the surgery. And by the time I got to Rebecca, she was already gone. But my hands were shaking during your operation. My concentration was shot. My judgment was compromised by grief. I should have handed your case to another surgeon, but I was too proud and too broken to admit I wasn't capable. Your blindness is the result of my arrogance and my failure." Sophia absorbed this revelation in silence, her face cycling through emotions too rapid to follow. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than angry. "So you chose duty over love, and we both paid the price." "Yes. And you've been punishing yourself for it ever since." "Yes." Sophia walked over to the chopping block where Nathan had been working and sat down heavily, suddenly looking exhausted. Do you know what the worst part of losing my sight was? Nathan shook his head, then remembered she couldn't see the gesture. Number, it wasn't the darkness. It wasn't even the loss of independence. It was feeling useless. Feeling like I had nothing to contribute, like I was just a burden that everyone had to pretend to care about out of pity. You're not a burden, Nathan said fiercely. You're the strongest person I've ever met. I didn't feel strong until I came here. Until you and Jake needed me, until I could help and contribute and matter again. Sophia paused, choosing her words carefully. The man who failed to save my sight and the man who saved my soul, they're the same person, aren't they? I suppose they are. Sophia stood up and walked toward Nathan, stopping just close enough that she could reach out and touch his face if she chose to. If you could go back to that night, knowing what you know now, would you make the same choice? Nathan answered without hesitation. Number, I would choose Rebecca. I would let someone else operate on you, and maybe they would have succeeded where I failed. Even knowing that Rebecca was already beyond saving? Even then. Because that's what love means, choosing the person who matters most, even when it's illogical. Sophia smiled for the first time since learning the truth, and Nathan felt his heart crack open with hope. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 3 years. Does that mean you can forgive me? I think, Sophia said slowly, that we've both been punishing ourselves for the same tragedy from different sides. Maybe it's time we learn to forgive ourselves instead. That evening, the 3 adults sat by the fire while Jake played with his wooden blocks nearby, building elaborate structures that he knocked down with gleeful destruction. The conversation that had seemed impossible that morning now felt inevitable, necessary, healing. I want to stay, Sophia announced, her voice firm with decision. Not because I don't have anywhere else to go, but because this is where I belong, with both of you. Are you sure? William asked. You could come back to New York, finish your MBA, take over parts of the company. You have your whole life ahead of you. I do have my whole life ahead of me, Sophia agreed. And I want to spend it here, helping Nathan rebuild his practice, learning to be the doctor I always wanted to be, raising Jake as if he were my own son. Nathan felt tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in 3 years, finally breaking free. I love you, he said simply. I've loved you since the day you saved Jake when I couldn't. I've loved you through every moment of joy and every moment of guilt. I'll love you for the rest of my life if you'll let me. I love you too, Sophia replied. All of you, the brilliant surgeon who saved so many people, the broken man who lost his way, and the gentle soul who helped me find mine. Jake looked up from his blocks with the serious expression he wore when processing important adult conversations. Does this mean Sophia is going to be my new mom? If that's okay with you, Sophia said, kneeling down to his level. Can I call you Mom? I would be honored. 6 months later, the small Vermont town had a new medical clinic, staffed by Dr. Nathan Hayes and his assistant, Sophia Sterling Hayes. Nathan had retaken his medical boards and slowly rebuilt his confidence through careful, methodical practice. Sophia had enrolled in a special program for medical students with disabilities, pursuing the dream she had abandoned years before. Together, they treated the vision problems of local residents, while Jake attended the small-town school and came home each day bursting with stories about his friends and his classes. William visited regularly, his relationship with his daughter stronger than it had ever been. He had established a foundation in Rebecca's memory that funded medical training for people with disabilities, and he took obvious pride in watching Sophia bloom in her new role as both healer and beloved family member. On a warm spring evening, the little family sat on their dock, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink. Jake was fishing with the patient concentration Nathan had taught him, while Sophia and Nathan sat close together, her head resting on his shoulder. I can't see the colors, Sophia said softly, but I can feel them, warm and peaceful and full of promise. What do they feel like? Jake asked, always interested in his mother's unique way of experiencing the world. Like the moment just before something wonderful is about to happen, Sophia replied. Nathan squeezed her hand, thinking about the long journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. He had learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past or pretending that pain had never existed. It was about finding the courage to build something beautiful from the pieces of what had been broken. I love you, he whispered into Sophia's hair. I love you too, she whispered back. All of us. This whole beautiful, complicated, perfectly imperfect family we've made together. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake caught his first fish of the season while his parents cheered and laughed, and for the first time in years, none of them were haunted by the ghosts of what they had lost. They were too busy living in the joy of what they had found.